Great. My name is Ariel Diamond, and I'm the symposium editor this year for the Colorado Technology Law Journal. It's been a wonderful experience, and I'm glad to be here today to introduce Ray Gifford, who will be moderating this panel. Ray is a partner at Wilkinson, Barker, Knauer here in the Denver office and a senior fellow for Silicon Flatirons. Before joining the firm, he served as president of the Progress and Freedom Foundation, and before that served as chairman of the Colorado Public Utilities Commission. He began his regulatory career as first Assistant Attorney General for Regulatory Law in the Colorado Attorney General's office. And Ray has also taught a wonderful course here at Colorado Law on law and economics utility regulation. Before this panel, I asked Ray if he would like me to include any other specifics in his bio, and he asked me to add a little bit of flair for him, and I quote, "I would add that I've staged multiple unsuccessful interventions to cure Phil Weiser's fast casual dining addiction, was taught antitrust by Chief Judge Wood, and have cursed Larry Strickling since 1999 when I found out I was bound as PUC chairman by a preposterous reading of the 96 Telecom Act he promulgated while FCC Common Carrier Bureau chief." And with that, I'll hand it over to Ray. Thank you.
Thanks, Ariel, and welcome back to our pre-lunch panel. It's great that everyone's here, and it's great we've gotten back into the proper digital broadband migration weather pattern, having the snowstorm start this evening. Somewhere Michael Powell is smiling. I am happy to lead this panel on the dynamics of industry structure. Let me briefly introduce our panelists. You can read their full bios in the program. But to my immediate left is Jeff Binder, who's the CEO of Layer3 TV. Next to Jeff is Balan Nair, who is the CTO of Liberty Global. Right next to Balan is Commissioner O'Reilly from it's the Communications Commission, right, Commissioner? Okay. And last but not least is Staci L from Google. As in any panel during the digital broadband migration, there's a lot of breadth to it. But let's try to put some meat on the bones. One of the things we tell ourselves here in the US is that we invite an industry structure that has some very strong kind of Schumpeterian dynamics, that incumbents can't stop upstarts, and that an entrepreneurial attitude distinguishes us compared to, say, Europe or the Asian economies, where there's a lot more national champions and a lot more incumbent protections. For instance, take a look at how we have generally treated Uber in this country as opposed to France. What ingredients make U.S. companies more apt and to adapt and innovate, even when doing so cannibalizes their legacy offerings, than those in other countries? And do we still do that, and do we do that well? With that question, let me start with you, Balan, since in your company's name is Liberty Global. And is it true that we are more dynamic and innovative than elsewhere?
I was hoping you'd start with somebody else. I can just build on that, but I'll take a shot at this. Yes, the United States by far leads in innovation by any measure. And I think two motivating drivers are competition. Competition brings the best out of most people, and creativity, etc. And wealth creation. The ability to create wealth in the United States is unprecedented. Now, there is an underlying ecosystem that supports both. One, access to capital, predictable type business models. Second, the U.S. government has brought a lot of predictability in the actual usage of capital, meaning that there are legal frameworks here that allows us to be able to, with very sure certainty, be able to make decisions and execute on plans. Second, intellectual property protection in the United States is the best by far. I mean, one can argue it's also been abused, but nevertheless, it's one of the best. And third, the management of, or the regulation of capital in the United States is also one of the best. One can argue we've probably gone the other direction in the last few years, but it doesn't matter. That's probably not as relevant as the fact that access to capital in the United States is what a big driver of what drives innovation in the United States. And so I think we'll continue to do that. We'll continue to lead the world. You can all boil it down to two things. One, hope and fear. Human beings always have these two things. Religions and a lot of things are built around that hope and fear. If you go to Europe and elsewhere, there's more fear than there is hope. And there's a lot more, and we do a lot of business in Europe. You have entrenched bodies and entrenched powers, invested interests that looks at it the other way. And to manage the status quo there, they've been able to stifle a lot of innovation, and that's not here in the United States.
So Jeff, you've been both on the giving access to capital and needing access to capital side of this in your career. Is that part of our dynamic advantage in the U.S., and are we keeping it?
Yes and yes. So it's interesting. The capital markets, from an entrepreneur's perspective, are very cyclical and to some degree secular. They go up and down over time. They generally track booms and busts in the public markets for the most part. They're not necessarily reflective of a given sector that happens to desire capital. It's more the other way around, that good economic conditions tend to have more capital available, and it tends to flow to the best idea at the time. It's generally a push more than a pull. And so you see, we saw great capital liquidity in the mid-90s, and that it wasn't the internet so much pulling, but it was the capital pushing, and that allowed that sector to just explode, literally at the end. But certainly in terms of growth. So I think it's a huge part of the success. Even if you look in Colorado, Colorado has a startup week, which I think they started 4 or 5 years ago, and the most recent one had 10,000 attendees. And that's a function of actually capital being available and being deployed in the state. If it wasn't for that fact, that startup week would still be the 200 or 300 people it was in 2011. So it's absolutely an endemic part of what makes us a great entrepreneurial country.
So Staci, Google started out as the plucky upstart that overturned markets and redefined the internet space. It seems to be a little something more than that now. You are dealing with your gigantic success in different parts of the world with different regulators and different regulatory outlooks. How would you, in some sense, rate and describe that in the U.S. versus elsewhere in the world? And one of the questions that has been with us very centrally since the Microsoft case in the 90s is how do you allow a large dominant firm and how do you watch it?
Mm-hmm. So I appreciate the questions, and yes, one of the big areas where we're focused from a business, legal, and policy perspective is the way that European governments and the European government is looking at Google and the products that we have on the market in Europe. And I would say we're still a plucky company. A lot of the transformations that are going to be occurring this year, and I think we're going to have our first earnings report tomorrow that will split up the various different business units that are going to be the new Alphabet companies once each of the companies spins off, I think is a very good way to look at how we want to remain that plucky company. So we're not just search, we're not just advertising. I spend the majority of my time working on our broadband access policies. We've got driverless cars. We've got contact lenses that measure your glucose levels. We've got balloons. We've got a whole host of products that we think continue to drive that innovation. It is 100% easier to be an American company and to roll out those innovations in the United States, working with the US government, US laws, and policies. The problem that we're facing in Europe today is in large part a move to protect European companies and a concern that European companies, European internet companies, are not developing in the same way that American internet companies are developing and have developed. And of course, we think that that fear is completely misplaced, and that if European countries had the same kinds of laws and policies that we had in the United States, I think Balan referred to IP protections. We have strong IP protections in the United States combined with fair use. We've got intermediary liability protections. We've got sector-specific privacy laws that focus on actual harms to consumers. Public policies that actually embrace breakthrough innovation. I would say that we don't see that same kind of environment in Europe. So it's not because Google is battering down competitors, it's because the environment doesn't build them up. It doesn't enable that kind of growth. And I think all of us in this sector need to support that kind of innovation outside of the United States so that it's not just a US company that can grow and become the kind of successful internet company that Google has been able to become.
So, Commissioner O'Reilly, to kind of take that to the next step and into the future, if we accept that it's true that the U.S. And Silicon Flatirons embodies this as well, has generally operated during the internet age with a neoliberal small l consensus on the way markets should operate, on the way laws should operate around that, and the institutional kind of infrastructure of innovation and market working. You also see a fairly powerful counter movement that has both emerged here and a national champions movement, certainly in, for instance, China's internet policy. Is that consensus eroding generally, and what are you seeing, where is that conversation right now about this neoliberal pro-innovation consensus?
So let me start with the original question and say yes, the American experiment has proven to be a tremendous success. I feel like I want to wave a flag. Given what's happening, it's the envy of the world by far. And to me, it comes from 2 points, and I think Balan highlighted this quite well, and maybe different nomenclature or different terms, but I think it comes from our capitalist society combined with our desire to improve our situation, which is not prevalent in other countries. That mixture has helped produce the innovative entrepreneurial skill set that is unique in the United States, that doesn't seem to be capable to be duplicated elsewhere. And you see that in other settings where other countries would love to have a high-tech sector as we do, and their number one goal is to steal our technology and replicate it because they don't have innovative ideas of their own. Their people aren't. That's not inborn to their people, and that's problematic. But to your point, to your second part of the question, I don't see this as an eroding the latest. Rise in different opinions. I don't see that as an eroding of our viewpoint. From time to time, there will come a discussion about different components of how society is treating different sectors or different parts, and how capitalism has an impact. I don't see that as long-standing. I see that as an opportunity to re-examine the benefits that come from capitalism. They come from the American experiment, and not as a downside. And your point on terms of China and in its internet policy, I do think is extremely harmful for them to pursue that. And you see that our policy for the last 20 some odd years has been a very free and open internet with some problems here and there that I'm happy to talk to later.
So one of the internet slogans we toss around is innovation without permission. And we cite that often as a great triumph of our kind of institutional architecture. what policy strategies made this happen, and do we need to continue them? And have there been unintended negative consequences of that innovation without permission ethos that is talked about so triumphantly? Jeff, Balan?
You start first.
Well, that's an interesting question. I think we've evolved. You know, 2 decades ago, much of what we talked about was the network and the necessity of the network itself being open and being free and be permissionless. It's different today. I think the network issues, to a major degree, are not the issues that stifle innovation. They're now all the things that the network connects to, whether it's security, whether it's entitlements, whether it's devices, whether it's other software that sits in the cloud. It's become much more complex, the question of how to keep that permissionless ecosystem open. The video space has its own set of very interesting permissions, notwithstanding the fact that we have an open internet and that Netflix and others can thrive. So it's much more complex today, and I think the danger is that we go back and look at the traditional places that we have regulated and assume that by continuing to regulate those, we are going to somehow solve that next generation of problems. We run a pretty high risk of ending up in a place where we don't get the objective that we set out to achieve. And that's it becomes more complex a problem too, because you can't just go, oh, it's that. It may be 10 things now. And the disruption of any one of those may cause ecosystems to fail. You know, a good example is 20 years ago, the record industry began a metamorphosis. And today, there is 40% of the revenue generated in the music industry than what there was in 1995. Now, I think it's healed and it's in a better place, but it was 2 decades of chaos for a lot of parties in the space. And so we have to be careful now that we don't start to pull out, you know, Jenga sticks and find that we end up collapsing the whole ecosystem around, which creates that permissionless society and permissionless opportunity.
I agree with that. You know, I think the model we have today does allow for entrepreneurs to take a lot more risks, and that's one of the beauties here in the system. The challenge is, you know, there is an unintended consequence because it only works when you're small. Every small company wants to become a big company. Every attacker, when you start a business, you're an attacker. You're trying to take something from somebody, you're trying to innovate somewhere, whatever it is. But when you become big, you become an incumbent. Now, you may think that you want to continue to be an attacker. The challenge is when you become big and you continue to be an attacker, there are a lot of vested interests in governments, policy guys. There's a lot of people that suddenly just all get all over you. And Google has experienced this. As you know, nobody really cared about what Google was doing until they became a multi-billion-dollar company. It happens to companies like ourselves. And the challenge for big companies then is when you get, you know, when there's this whole, you know, bunch of attorneys and policy guys and governments descend on you, your cost structure changes dramatically. The way you run your business changes dramatically. So naturally, an attacker, it's very hard to remain an attacker when you get big. And that's an unintended consequence. Now, I'm not arguing whether it's good or bad, because there's a lot of good where you don't want 2 or 3 companies dominating the world, that's for sure. But but there is there has to be a balance on how innovation continues, even when you get big. Because remember, once again, like I said, every small company wants to become a big company, right? And the challenge is when you become big, you become a very different company and a very different business, and your level of innovation starts dropping.
Staci, have you stopped innovating?
Well, and I thought that was a really good point for Balan to end on, because the challenge of a company like Google is to be able to respond to the startups, to respond to the disruptors. And I don't think that we've stopped innovating.
That's why you had to break up. I think it was smart. You know,
And hopefully you're right, although I don't think we consider it breaking up. We're reorganizing our business model so that we're all
For tax reasons.
for tax reasons, for innovation reasons. You know, the division that I work most closely with, the Access Division, was started with the broadband gigabit experiment. And at the time, it was an experiment. It was rising to the challenge of the FCC's National Broadband Plan to show that things could be done differently, that we could deploy gigabit networks, that we could do it in a way that was economically feasible and that would deliver a product to consumers that was bringing a lot of value where they in the past hadn't had the opportunity to access that kind of speed. And one of the reasons why it was important for Google and why Google could do it is because the more people that are online and the more people that are accessing the various products that Google and Netflix and the other internet companies are offering, the better it is for the ecosystem, and it allows us to continue to innovate. It allows us to be nimble and to be able to respond when there's a new company that comes along with a better business model that's more consumer friendly, that's delivering the services that people are looking for, and we can move more quickly to be able to respond to that. But I think sort of going back to your first question and then bringing in the second question, you know, one of the things that we think is really important for everybody to think about when you talk about permissionless innovation is that it is not regulationless innovation. So there are very often regulations that enable this environment. Regulations such as the CDA and intellectual property protections, that they're regulations. You know, no one would argue that they're not. But it creates an environment where YouTube can come to market and really explode in the amount of video that consumers can access. And the thing that I think that we need to be most cautious about is when any of us are looking for or calling for new regulations to protect that innovative environment. We need to look not just at what problem it's solving. Are we protecting children and privacy and security? But we need to look at the consequences of that regulation. And so having that balance to make sure that the investment environment and the access to capital and all of that continues is a really important part of maintaining the permissionless innovation environment. And I think Google's going to continue to grow and innovate and roll out new products that are going to surprise and delight people. And for me, that's one of the coolest things about working for the company is that we're not static in any way.
Jeff?
I was just going to add to what Balan said. You know, we don't really have much regulation in that dream state, that foundational sort of capital goes in, you come up with an idea. It's that state where you go from dream to reality. That's really where companies are the most vulnerable. The company that's in reality with a large balance sheet and Washington lobbyists and all the rest of it will survive. Mm-hmm. Its business isn't at risk. Its margin profile may be at risk. Its structure may be at risk, but its business isn't at risk. The young dreamer company, 98% of them fail. It's that 2 to 3% that have to make their way to reality. That's where the ecosystem and regulation really does need to help, because they're vulnerable. They're now, as Balan was talking about, they now are really becoming an attacker. They're not just the idea of an attacker, they're actually an attacker. And that's the state in which they don't have the balance sheet, they don't have the capital, they're in that performance phase of their life cycle, and they're at most risk of never quite making it into space, so to speak, from an escape velocity perspective.
Well, let's take that, because that seems like a very important and salient kind of way to think about that is the innovation, small innovators, the large incumbents, and that path between them. Commissioner O'Reilly, the FCC in its history has not always covered itself in glory in terms of.
I haven't been there that long. So.
It's not your fault.
Of the way it has either protected incumbents or done other lawless things. And since this is a law school, one of the things we talk about often are the difference between rules and standards, right? And standards, the classic utility regulation standard is the public interest. When the public interest is at stake, you can superintend anything and everything. And you need the armies of lobbyists and lawyers, God bless them, by the way, to make it to that larger level. How do you, as a commissioner looking at this, weigh those issues? And how do you think about rules and standards and about how the FCC as an institution is both making sure Staci's company is honest and not stifling innovation, but also has the room to continue on and innovate like they have historically?
Sure. So if I go back to your original point, the permissionless innovation economy that we have today, I believe, is under assault. And I've made this point numerous times by the FCC and some of the decisions it's made in the last couple of years. It has added burdens that these companies have talked about, that my panelists have talked about, added new burdens that make you question whether you're going to deploy new products and new services at certain times, whether you're actually going to go down a certain road. I don't have any particular things to regarding Google in your last part of your point, because they generally don't have a lot of products before us, which is probably smart. They generally operate outside of that, and I think that's in my opinion, working with them for many years, that's generally an intentional decision that they made, that they don't enter a lot of space which heavy regulated. They can operate in different space that's not treated by the FCC. So I worry about the small company that's trying to figure out how do I go to market, how do I grow my business. The point was made very well by my colleagues here that the big companies will always be able to handle regulatory structure. They will be able to handle whatever we throw at them. It will cost a burden on their balance sheet. It will require them to employ new people, but they'll survive. And in fact, it may, in many instances, help protect their market share, which is not a great outcome. It's the small companies I worry about and have talked about for many, many times. And a number of the big decisions we've made recently, which shall remain nameless, have an impact on those small companies. And the Commission has generally not given it a proper attention. And it will drive out innovation in that space going forward. So when I look at companies and where they're going to spend their time, where they're going to spend their capital, where they're going to spend their resources, if I were giving advice, it would be on those things that are outside the Commission's bailiwick. And then I'll give you an example on something that Staci brought up very well, CVAA. The chairman of the FCC has made clear that he wants that to be, a primary concern.
CVAA, let's...
Okay, so disability accessibility to technology has made it, and it's a statute, and so I support it, and we'll implement it. But he's made clear he wants companies to look at that as their, as a primary function when they're putting together what they're going to do. But no company thinks about it as the first part. They're thinking about a vision, a dream, what they would like to offer, and then it's naturally something else. And a lot of other things are naturally going to be a second concern or tertiary concern. They're not the first thing when you're trying to figure out, I would like to create an app, is not about the CVAA. It's just naturally not there. And so I just think that we're approaching it wrong from a regulatory standpoint.
So Jeff, when you hear the words, we need to talk to the FCC as a upstart, newer company, does that give you heartburn?
No, I think actually it's the opposite. I think it's an opportunity to bring to the fore some of that early stage energy and vision and challenges and put them before different parties in the Commission so that they can understand the challenges we're reaching. We don't have the breadth of lobbyists and capital to put out there so people are going to lunch every day and explaining what's going on inside their company. I don't wake up in the morning and worry about whether Google or not is going to get its point across. I know it will. I'm absolutely certain of that, even if they have to allocate all the search terms for the category on the browser. But one way
I actually thought that was a compliment.
But we have to educate because nobody pays attention to what we do. They'll pay attention eventually to Balan's point when we're finally successful. But going through that phase, I don't look at it as that. What would be troublesome is if the parties weren't listening and the parties weren't really trying to understand, because it's at the level that we're at now where we're feeling where the points of tension are and where the points of freedom are. And understanding those, and it's relatively few actually on both sides, understanding what those are what kinds of things can help companies to grow, this is the stage in which the Commission should be listening to companies. It's fine to listen to Google and Comcast and Liberty, but they have all kinds of avenues to speak to everybody. The little companies don't, and they're the ones that really understand what it takes to succeed. And it's a big deal. So no, it doesn't. I think it's actually an important part of our organization's effort is to make sure we reach out to people in government and let them understand our experiences, and not so much take positions on issues, because I think once you can educate folks on what the types of things you're dealing with are, they come to the same conclusion you would. There isn't much white space in how you would think about solving the problem once you have the totality of sort of issues that you're facing.
Let's bring antitrust into this discussion at this point. Let's leave the FCC, and you may want to, Commissioner. Right?
I enjoy my job. Thank you very much.
But antitrust has historically, played a generally regulating role in our economy, both as it relates to horizontal mergers and vertical. Now, in some cases, that's overlapping with, say, FCC jurisdiction. In other cases, it's not, since it's an agency or it's a set of laws, rather, of general applicability. Balan, dealing with things on a global scale and having at least some passing knowledge of U.S. antitrust policy, do we strike the right balance here versus, say, your experiences in Europe, and where does antitrust fit into this and antitrust thinking?
Well, certainly in the eye of the beholder here, on the view you would take on this. Google is an example. There can be overreach with antitrust, and certainly you can make a case, depending which side of the fence you sit on, to stifle any trajectory, whatever the business model is of any company. In the United States, the Comcast / Time Warner cable deal, because of change in, and there's so many different views on this, but a change in the way how you calculate what's broadband speeds, one can argue, suddenly changed the whole dynamics of that discussion. Microsoft, an extremely innovative company, pioneered by real smart entrepreneurs, today is no longer the company it used to be, because almost any decision in Microsoft you make right now, there's about 5 lawyers that need to approve it to make sure that you didn't violate some agreement you made in Europe, some agreement you made in the United States with different, it's, so I think the antitrust regime serves a purpose. The worry I always have is, in our company is when it overreaches. And of course, once again, it's in the, from where we sit, the least intervention in that space, the better it is for the consumer. You have to trust that entrepreneurs, smart people, and capital flows will always even the playing field. If you don't trust that, then there will be a lot more antitrust cases out there.
So I think, Balan, you just said that the antitrust is 0 for 2 in the 2 examples you cited.
Yeah.
Jeff, do you think at all about antitrust in the stage of your company is, and do you think antitrust is a valuable lever or an inhibition to our innovation ecology in the U.S.?
Every morning when I wake up, I think about antitrust. First thing I think of, I brush my teeth.
You live an interesting life.
I look and see who's running the DOJ's antitrust division this week, and look, we have a couple issues that are interesting around both broadband and video, and that is how they sort of resolve ultimately to the First Amendment, the Fourth Estate, and I think so. We have to think about broadband policy and even video policy from a slightly different lens than we think about the milk producer that might have 80% of the market, or even the operating system manufacturer like a Microsoft. So I think it is It's not something I think about regularly because I hope not to have to deal with it either as a plaintiff or defendant. But it is a factor, and I think we have to be really careful to understand that fundamentally we're probably protecting something more than just market power, which is traditionally the way you think about antitrust. But I think when it comes to broadband, and I think when it comes to video and communication and social extensibility, that you have a broader sort of mandate when it comes to that. There's greater impacts that the traditional antitrust levers or metrics are I think are heightened in the case of these two paradigms. So it is important, and I think I think of it more from almost an American lens than I do a entrepreneurial lens, which is making sure we can communicate with one another in a free fashion, less so the idea that maybe we need to keep those things going to encourage the economic side of antitrust.
So, Commissioner O'Reilly, on this same point, here's how I'd preface it and maybe just get you to react, which is kind of orthodox antitrust theory starts, it doesn't end with, but it starts with neoclassical economic notions of market power and concentration and so on and so forth. It is often, and I think to an extent Balan said some of this as well, it's often pointed out that it doesn't adequately account for kind of the Schumpeterian dynamic efficiency issues that are dealt with in the digital economy, for instance. Your agency obviously stands at the crossroads on some issues with the antitrust analysis. Do you think current antitrust doctrines keeping up with the kind of Schumpeterian impulses of this space, and how do you come up with an antitrust law that is doctrinally supple enough to deal with it?
Wow. Well, a couple things. First, conversation has talked about particular mergers that have been in the past and maybe in the future, whatever the case. And I never make any comments, so my comments are general and not applicable to anything on that line. And two, you know that antitrust law, and you'll hear about this more tomorrow from experts who operate on a daily basis, can discuss it more. The Commission doesn't use it straightforward. It has its public interest standard, but if you follow recent activity, you'll see that the argument has been made by numerous times, including by our General Counsel, that antitrust is the foundation for a number of our activities and our decision making in recent items. So I think it's still prevalent. There have been people who have put forward the argument that the FCC and its approach to regulating should be replaced with an antitrust-like model. I still think there's value in the FCC, or wouldn't have taken this job. I do think there are ways to fix how we approach issues and how we do move forward on a public interest standard. So I'm in favor of reform, but I'm not ready to and don't endorse the idea of throwing away that model. So and to your the way you framed it with me is is it still appropriate? And can it, what changes do I see to it? I'm in a previous life, I might be able to give you the better answer to the second part. In the first part, it may be a very effective tool in dealing with a number of issues, and we should explore it, and it should be allowed to be used by other agencies that they use that as the foundation of their activities, and they can be very beneficial rather than everything being at the FCC.
So, Staci, let's talk intellectual property.
Sure.
It can either enable or disable innovation, as it were. The DMCA's notice and takedown provision, I think, enables smaller firms to operate and impose obligation to process requests. Section 230 of the Communications Act, meanwhile, provides a more protective environment insofar as it immunizes internet-based platforms from liability like newspapers and so forth. What sorts of obligations in the nature of preventing infringement are appropriate to impose in the online environment? and how should policymakers balance that concern with one around ensuring openness of entry and innovation?
Right. So, it's not often the case that you can say that lawmakers actually passed a law in 1998 that seemed to take into account what the future was going to look like. They didn't know how the internet would develop, what kinds of online publishing would develop, the video services that would be available online. But in fact, we believe that Congress got it right in 1998 when they passed the CDMA, or DMCA, that the shared responsibility approach is the right approach. And in fact, it has given online providers like Google the ability to flourish. And it's not just Google, it's Google, YouTube, Netflix, Yahoo, eBay, a whole host of online companies, and also protected the rights of rights holders. So when a rights holder comes to Google and says that YouTube video violates my rights, I need you to take it down, they're in the position to be able to judge whether or not the copyright has been violated. We're not in the position to make that judgment, and the law sets up that right balance, that shared responsibility approach, and we think it's been successful. We work very closely with the content creators on YouTube, and not 100%, but overwhelmingly, we have found that it's a very good partnership when we're alerted to those violations. We're also finding that increasingly copyright owners are welcoming certain kinds of use of their content that might not be formally authorized. And I heard a presentation from one of our executives on the YouTube team about the way everybody's favorite song, Let It Go, from the movie Frozen, has really flourished because of the secondary uses. And what's happening is that teenagers, children, adults, everybody who loves the song is taking it and making their own videos. And we believe, and working closely with Disney, talking to them on this, that it's contributed to the viral marketing of the movie. And you all may know that Frozen is the highest grossing animated movie ever. We didn't cause that, but certainly the way that the content can be used because of the protections from the DMCA has helped with that marketing of the movie and the song. So these fan-driven uses that are enabled under the law have been really beneficial. But we also deal with piracy. We deal with it every day, and we think it's a really important and difficult issue. So we've taken matters into our hands to be able to protect against some of that piracy. And we've created a product called Content ID. And what Content ID does, it's a complement to the law. It enables content users to provide information to YouTube to be able to identify when their content is being used. And then they have a choice. They can tell us in advance how they want us to treat that content. They can either put a stop to it, they can track it, or they can monetize it. And we have found that the majority of our partners want to monetize it. And so it's not stopping the use, but it's creating different uses. And that is not driven by law. And we think, want to make very clear that if there was a law in place that required somebody like YouTube to create a product like Content ID or go out and purchase it and deploy it as part of the video streaming, YouTube wouldn't have been able to launch back when we did. So, these are the kinds of solutions and policies that are enabled with further innovation. And also because, YouTube was a bigger company at the time when we launched Content ID, and we were able to do that. So the DMCA has been successful. Our technology, Content ID, has been successful in protecting the intellectual property and the copyrighted material. But importantly, we believe that legal sources and legal access to the content. So, whether it's been Netflix or the Apple Store or Hulu or any of the number of services where users can pay for copyrighted content, and this new market that is built up around that, has been an equally important aspect of the copyright and intellectual property protection.
Jeff, do you think we're getting our intellectual property rights, the balance right these days?
It's a tough question. I think to some degree, yes. I think it's important that we respect the role of content creation. I think it's critical. There's no question that somebody who creates something fundamentally should have, a broad range of tools to protect themselves. Distribution gets a little bit more complex, and so the question of how something that someone else has created can then be distributed by the next party in the chain, and of course then there's another party after that that distributes it in our current ecosystem. That one needs more, probably, I'm not sure the balance is quite right yet. I think we evolved to a certain place where we had a very strict ecosystem of creation, aggregation, or distribution and aggregation, and that has evolved as the result of broadband and as the result of being able to take IP video technologies and audio and deliver them to consumers. And there we probably have some work to do, because those models were fairly effective and probably not punitive, if you look back a decade, because there were certain basic, fundamental, much bigger things you had to do to get access to that content. And today it's different. The bar is much, much lower. The aggregation and distribution bars are not what they used to be. You don't have to go build a Liberty Global and dig up streets and go to the house. You can reach that via other means. And I think in that sense, we need to be careful that we both honor the intent of the monetization schema that the content owner wants to have. But once it leaves that paradigm, I think then we have to be a little bit more sensitive to the entire distribution ecosystem, not just necessarily the IP rights once they've been sort of relinquished into the system.
Anything quick, and then we'll get to Balan?
Well, I'd say I think we've got it right on the creative IP, and certainly we want to protect that. I think on the technology IP, certainly the Patent Office have not been able to keep up with the technology changes and the rapid moving of where innovation comes from and how it manifests itself. And therefore, you have an element of inefficiencies there that's been exploited by patent trolls and folks that are actually trying to monetize ill-conceived patent grants to stifle or to stop innovation in the industry. And that's something that certainly, the policy guys, the government needs to pay a lot more closer attention to, or that could be a problem, not necessarily in the next 5 years, but certainly in the next 10 to 20 years.
Having spent time working on DMCA and Section 230, I strongly support IP protections, but those rights in law are not absolute. And as we go along from here, technology is going to make those challenges more difficult. And those, we're having a debate on first sale doctrine. What does that mean going forward? And so it's going to be more complex and challenges for people outside my job to have to solve.
So there you have it. The creative IP rights are about right, so we can throw out like 5 years of digital broadband migration conferences in the early 2000s when it was the knockdown, drag-out fight of the day. Let's go to questions, beginning, as always, with students. Yes. And please wait for the mic so we can record you for posterity.
My question's for the panel generally. So you've talked about the burdens on innovation of both regulation and antitrust. Which do you think is more onerous?
Sorry, the last one?
Which do you think is more onerous? Which do you think is more burdensome?
Antitrust
or regulations?
Or regulation. Yeah, to me, it's one and the same in many cases. And by the way, I'm not saying that both are bad. It's bad only when it oversteps its boundaries, and where you try to perpetuate, like in Europe, certain things that Google is experiencing, they would never have experienced in the United States. So here you have a regulatory body that decides how do they keep themselves relevant in this new environment, and therefore overreach on their responsibilities, and suddenly you're faced with a set of rules that didn't exist, right? That's what would be really bad. So hopefully that answers your question. Overreach is always bad.
Mark being recognized not for a speech, but for a question.
I think we might get a speech.
So the impression I get is that the entrepreneur developing a product should worry about the intellectual property laws and design it so it obeys those intellectual property laws, but not the disability laws. Wait a minute, shouldn't the entrepreneur who's going to bring a product to market develop products that are likely to be legal?
Sure.
And
So-
shouldn't the venture capitalists say, no, you don't get any money for that because that's not going to be legal? What's wrong with people obeying the damn law when they're innovators?
Sure.
There you go,
I'll answer it
Commissioner O'Reilly.
or how I was referencing it, and I was suggesting it's never going to be the first thing that a company or an individual thinks about when they come up with a creative idea and an app when they're sitting on their couch in their underwear. That's not going to be the first thing that comes to, and I would never expect it to be. Do I think they still have an obligation to comply with the law? Absolutely, until Congress changes the law or does something to it. So that's where I was coming from the perspective.
So the law is not an inhibitor of innovation.
Well, the law can be an inhibitor. I'm not good.
But the law is the law, and as long as the law is there, that's the only space you can innovate.
Mark, you did so well. That was the first time in 15 years you've actually just asked a question.
Let me address that. We deal with some of the disability requirements that may or may not apply to us, and certainly they weren't the thing that I woke up and thought about like I do with antitrust in the morning. But we look at them as a footnote, and there's something that we think should be done because they represent a good ethos on the part of what we do for our product. But we just do them. It's not it's certainly in the video space, having closed captioning is not something that you should or should not do because of regulation. You should do it because it's the right thing to do. But we don't build a closed captioning product. That might be somebody else who would do that. We would go and leverage the existing closed captioning technologies, deploy them. There's probably some cost or burden associated with it, but it's not even the tail on the dog. It's just a hair on the tail. It's a relatively small issue, I think, fundamentally. I don't dream about solving that problem. I dream about solving a much bigger problem, and of course making sure that we bring everybody along for the ride.
Yep.
So we've kind of talked about this. It's kind of been a theme, but for those of us in the public sphere, when you see technologies move from luxury to essential for whatever community you represent, how do we balance that? For example, the obvious one is universal broadband access. That's become an essential function. Our regulatory system isn't quite set up for that yet. I could see something else, a healthcare technology or a public safety technology move from nice to essential for our communities to function. How do we deal with that in the conversation of, we don't want to inhibit innovation, but when something becomes that critical, you have to make sure it works or people have access or whatever it happens to be?
So I'm not sure this answers your question, but I'll take a stab at it from the perspective of Google Fiber. Today, a gigabit connection is not essential. There were panelists on the first panel that seemed to think a significantly slower rate of maybe 4 megabits or something was important, but we want it to be essential. And we want it to be essential because what we believe the ecosystem will be able to deliver in terms of the types of apps and the interactions and the communication tools that people will have access to when they have a gigabit connection will really change the way we live our lives. That's a future that we would like to see. So I was, my point to your question about how do we deal with that, today there are a significant number of regulations, primarily at the local level. A lot of them are permitting regulations, construction requirements, things like that, but also at the federal level that didn't envision the type of deployment that we want to be able to do. So that's, rapid deployment to large geographic areas. And so the way that we deal with that is that policymakers need to move quickly to streamline those regulations. In some instances, there might be new regulations that are necessary that take into account this new service and the new type of deployment. And so we need to move quickly with our public policies to be able to accommodate that type of innovation and investment and deployment that we as a country haven't seen to date. That's one piece of, I'm hoping, what you were asking.
Balan?
There's a number of things that are essential, right? Shelter, security, food, those are essential. The question becomes who determines what else is essential. Okay, we could say society is determined, education is essential, health is essential. Then you may decide broadband is essential or smartphones is essential. That, once again, you have to draw the line on one, who determines what's essential, and two, who funds this essential need. And the best way to solve for a lot of it, if it's truly essential, there will be an entrepreneur that'll try to fill that hole because essential would mean demand, right? So if there's such a demand, somebody should be able to fill it. Now, there are inefficiencies in our society where sometimes it is not necessarily commercially viable to meet an essential role. And government could play a role there, but it is very dangerous for governments to decide what's essential for us beyond the basics.
Any final thoughts?
Well, I was just going to comment, and I've had this issue, and I've talked about it a couple different times. It's really picking the words you use. People, you can call it essential. I've debated necessity, and I think Balan does a very good job. There are certain things that you have to have in life. Broadband can be one of those that is very important, and we can figure out how to right phrase it. But I don't think it's essential to living. And so I'm trying to figure out how do you balance that out. Telephone service is still not to 100% of Americans. We're at 96. We're probably dropped to 93. I think it's my last look at it. So there is still a portion of the population that, for a number of different reasons, don't have telephone service, and it's not essential. They still exist. So we have to be. I just try to be really careful in the wording that's used.
Jeff, any last thoughts?
And just to add to that, when I think of essential, I think of either life or death or disability. So to the extent that things go beyond that, certainly gigabit Ethernet is not essential to my existence, although it'd be nice.
Be nice.
But an emergency alert in Joplin, Missouri, when an F5 tornado is coming to my house and is about to take it down, probably falls into the essential category. So I think we have to be careful, to Balan's point, of being very cautious about expanding that definition beyond what we all can agree more or less is essential.
Okay.
Well, I want to thank our panel. I want to thank you. We are now at lunch and reconvene at 1:30.
Thank you. Enjoyed the conversation.